There is a photograph in the Humboldt Redwood State Park archive from 1915 that breaks the human brain's sense of scale. 3 men stand inside a hollowed-out stump. They aren't standing beside it, they are engulfed by it. The wood around them is wider than a 2-car garage, rising like the charred walls of a cathedral. This tree was felled in 1912, milled into fence posts and railroad ties, and scattered across the West. No ceremony was held, no one recorded the frequency of its fall. The stump remains today a remarkable curiosity for tourists. But remarkable is just the word we use for things we cannot explain. To look at that photo is to accept a terrifying reality. A living organism older than the Norman conquest, taller than a 20-story building, was converted into raw material in a single afternoon. We didn't just lose trees, we lost a biological memory. You have never stood beneath a 3,000-year-old canopy. You have never heard the silence of a world that existed before Rome fell. The transition from a 380-foot redwood to a 40-mile-tall canopy tree is not a jump in logic, it is a jump in scaling. If the industrial system of the 1880s could erase 2 million acres of ancient forest in 60 years, we must ask what a more advanced, more ancient system could have done to the planet before our written records began. The redwoods are the second growth of a much larger world. When Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, stood in Humboldt County in 1907, he used a phrase that should have redefined geology. He looked at the 20-foot wide stumps and called them a field of truncated monuments. He was a bureaucrat, not a poet, yet he instinctively recognized that he was standing in the ruins of a biological architecture. If we apply Pinchot's monument logic to the global landscape, the volcanic labels on our mountains begin to dissolve. Consider the chemical process of permineralization. This is a documented, repeatable phenomenon where organic matter is replaced cell by minerals, usually silica or calcium carbonate, under high pressure. We accept this for petrified wood when it is the size of a log. We find these logs in Arizona, their bark and rings turn to solid quartz. But why does the science stop at the size of a log? There is no ceiling to chemistry. If a 300-foot tree can petrify, a 40-mile-tall tree can petrify. The result would not look like a tree to our tiny eyes. It would look like a mountain of crystalline rock. The evidence for this macrobiology is written in the vascular symmetry of the stone. In a modern redwood, the sapwood and heartwood are organized in concentric rings to transport nutrients against gravity. In the Table Mountains and mesas of the world, we see the exact same architecture on a titanic scale. Look at Devil's Tower in Wyoming. Mainstream geology calls it a volcanic plug, magma that cooled inside a volcano that later eroded away. But look at the columns, they are hexagonal. In biology, the hexagon is the most efficient shape for packing vascular bundles, seen in the stems of plants and the honeycombs of bees. In geology, columnar jointing is used to explain these shapes, claiming they formed as lava cooled and contracted. However, cooling lava is chaotic, it produces irregular angles and varying diameters. The columns at Devil's Tower and the Giant's Causeway exhibit a mathematical uniformity that suggests a biological blueprint, not a thermal accident. They are the petrified plumbing of a planetary-scale organism. This brings us to the oxygen question. During the Carboniferous period, atmospheric oxygen was 35%, nearly double our current 21%. We know this from the fossils of megafauna, dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans and millipedes as long as cars. Because insects breathe through their skin via diffusion, they cannot grow to those sizes in our thin air. They would suffocate. To maintain a 35% oxygen saturation across the entire globe, the photosynthetic engine of the planet had to be exponentially larger than what we see today. You cannot reach 35% oxygen with 150-foot trees, even if you covered every inch of the earth in them. The math doesn't resolve, but if the trees were 40 miles tall, reaching into the stratosphere, they would function as atmospheric scrubbers on a celestial scale. A single grove of canopy trees would produce more oxygen than an entire modern continent of forest. We live in a low oxygen world because the primary producers, the master trees, were leveled. We are the moss growing on the stumps of a world that once breathed a deeper, richer air. The conflict of evidence is also found in the root systems. In Shiprock, New Mexico, there are radial dikes extending from the central formation. Geology claims these are magma-filled cracks, but look at their orientation. They grow outward and dive downward into the crust. In biology, this is called gravitropism, the innate ability of a root to sense gravity and grow toward the center of the Earth. Magma follows the path of least resistance, which is usually horizontal or upward. These dikes are the petrified anchors of a system that needed to hold 40 miles of vertical timber against the rotation of the Earth. The journals of the 19th century fellers describe the ground shaking when a 300-foot redwood fell. Tremors felt a quarter-mile away. Now imagine the frequency of a 40-mile tall tree falling. The sound would have been a planetary event, a phase shift that would have rippled through the crust and changed the very resonance of the atmosphere. The great flood myths of ancient cultures often describe a collapse of the sky. If the sky was actually a canopy of leaves 40 miles high, its removal would look exactly like a celestial collapse. The water retention, the fog collection, and the electrical grounding of the planet would have vanished in an afternoon. Finally, we must look at the economic logic of extraction. The timber industry of 1850 didn't see a forest, they saw material. A 3,000-year-old tree represented zero value until it was cut. This is the externality problem. The market cannot price the value of a standing tree, its carbon sequestration, its soil stabilization, its acoustic environment. Therefore, the system is structurally incapable of recognizing its worth. This same logic was applied to the Great Canopy. The harvesters who preceded us didn't see mountains, they saw a silicon resource. They saw the mineralized wood of a 40-mile tree as building material for a civilization we are no longer allowed to remember. We are left with the truncated monuments, the stumps of a harvested garden. While we walk through the second growth and call it nature, the conflict is not found in the dirt, it is found in the labels. Between 1850 and 1910, as the last of the 300-foot redwoods were being systematically erased, the American government was simultaneously mapping the West. This was the birth of the General Land Office and the U.S. Geological Survey. These institutions didn't just record the land, they rebranded it. They were operating under an explicit mandate of manifest destiny, the belief that the continent was a blank slate for industrial civilization. To fulfill this, the Old World had to be stripped of its mystery. A 300-year-old tree was an obstacle to a farm. A 40-mile-tall petrified stump was a mineral resource to a nation. The institutional defense against the Stump Hypothesis is the concept of pareidolia, the psychological phenomenon where the human brain sees familiar patterns in random data. When you look at the hexagonal columns of Devil's Tower and see vascular bundles, the geologist is trained to tell you that you are suffering from a visual hallucination. They tell you that cooling basalt happens to mimic biological plumbing by mere coincidence. But the math of coincidence fails at this scale. In the 19th century, the journals of the fellers and the mill workers described the trees in terms that modern science has scrubbed from the record. They spoke of the green cathedral effect, light so filtered by height that it behaved like stained glass. They spoke of acoustic pockets where sound traveled for miles without echo. These were sensory experiences that the economic system could not price, so it simply deleted them from the textbooks. The Timber and Stone Act of 1878 is the smoking gun of this conflict. It allowed private individuals to buy 160 acres of unfit land for $2.50 an acre. Unfit for cultivation meant the land was covered in old-growth forest. The government effectively labeled the most complex biological systems on the planet as garbage land to facilitate their conversion into fence posts. This same labeling trap is applied to our mountains today. By calling a plateau a mesa, we strip it of its vertical history. We are taught to look at the terraced benches of a mountain and see erosion layers, even though they perfectly match the benches of a modern open-pit mine. The conflict is that our natural wonders are actually industrial ruins, and the academic system is the night watchman ensuring we don't look too closely at the scars. Consider the six-finger trace. In the Humboldt archives and the Gifford-Pinchot papers at the Library of Congress, there are subtle anomalies that never made it into the public history of forestry. There are descriptions of specialized heavy-lift winches and oversized saws that require an ergonomics that do not fit a standard human hand. The guardians who managed the Great Canopy before the harvesters arrived were scaled to the world they lived in. But the 19th century timber industry didn't just inherit the trees, they inherited the ruins. When Theodore Roosevelt and Pinchot organized the National Forest System in 1905, they weren't protecting the wilderness, they were securing the leftovers. The most valuable, most accessible old growth had already been processed. The reserves were the areas the industry hadn't yet found a way to profitably remove. The conflict persists today because the information system is deficient. The market cannot tell us what we are destroying because the market has no mechanism for pricing the etheric grounding of a 40-mile tree. We have the vocabulary of carbon sequestration now, but it is a shallow replacement for the electrical and hydrological reality of the Great Canopy. The stumps that remain in the soil of California, some 20 feet across, make our living trees look like saplings. Yet we are told these saplings are the peak of nature. This is the institutional gaslighting. We are living in a thinned-out, low-pressure, low-oxygen shadow of a world, and we are told this is the way it has always been. The stone remembers what the bronze forgot. The soil remembers what the saw removed. And the question that nobody wants to hold is, what did that forest do when it was operating as designed? The final reveal is not that the trees were 40 miles tall. It is that the world we inhabit is a processed environment. We are the beneficiaries of a liquidation sale we didn't know was happening. When you look at the foundations of our oldest cities, the massive red brick cathedrals, the star forts, the granite government buildings of the 19th century, you are looking at the repurposed heartwood of a planetary harvest. The timber wasn't just wood, it was the structural lattice of a silicon world. We are told these cities were built by horse and buggy, by men with primitive tools in a matter of years. But the math of labor doesn't resolve. These cities were found, not built, in the same way a settler finds a 20-foot redwood stump and turns it into a house. The Stump Hypothesis is the only framework that explains the global terracing of the Earth. From the Grand Canyon to the Ural Mountains, the landscape is stepped. Geologists call this differential erosion, the idea that softer rock layers wore away faster than harder ones over millions of years. But if you look at a modern open-pit copper mine, the benches are identical. They are terraced to provide stability for heavy machinery during extraction. Our national parks are the abandoned quarry pits of a civilization that operated on a vertical scale we are no longer allowed to perceive. The mesa is not a table, it is a processing platform. The butte is not a hill, it is the slag heap of a mineral harvest. We are living in the ruins of a global factory, and we have been taught to call the debris scenic views. This brings us to the frequency secret. Beethoven's tuning fork, sitting in a glass case at the British Library, vibrates at 455.4 Hz. Today we tune our instruments to 440 Hz, a dissonant, aggressive frequency that creates tension in the human nervous system. The old world was tuned to the resonance of the Great Canopy. Those 40-mile trees were not just biological, they were acoustic pillars. They grounded the sky, turning the atmosphere into a pressurized resonant chamber. When the trees fell, the aether went silent. The great thinning began. The oxygen dropped, the pressure fell, and the music of the world shifted from a harmonic resonance to a chaotic static. This is why our ancient cathedrals have ghost chimneys and copper domes. They were attempts to catch the lingering atmospheric charge that the trees once provided for free. The question is no longer, did these trees exist? The question is, who is currently managing the second growth? If the first growth was removed in 60 years, and the Great Canopy was removed in a prehistoric afternoon, we are currently in the regeneration phase. But we aren't the gardeners, we are the moss. We provide the carbon that the next harvest will require. The stumps are still there, reminding those with eyes to see that the earth was once a managed garden of silicon and light. The six-finger tools, the truncated monuments of Gifford Pinchot, and the 1915 photo of the men inside the hollowed stump are all breadcrumbs leading to the same door. We do not live on a planet, we live in a quarry. And the mountains we climb are the only records left of the giants that once held up the sky. The forest that was there before took 3,000 years to become what it was. It was removed in 60. The math does not resolve. The stone remembers what the bronze forgot. The soil remembers what the saw removed. And the question that nobody seems to want to hold for very long is not whether we could have done it differently. The question is, when is the next harvest scheduled to begin?